So welcome to the Sustainable Business Council's annual lecture series. This is the kickoff lecture for this year's series. It will be on sustainable venturing. Tonight's, or the entire year's lecture series is sponsored this year by the U of M School of Business, Balance Tech, Livesey All Systems Freight, Rocking M Design, the Missoula Independent, and Williams Real Estate. And so I'd hope you'd help us recognize those sponsors. We also have a number of folks who provided food and beverages and services for tonight. They include The Bridge Pizza, Kettle House Brewing, Bitterroot Acupuncture and Herbarium, and then also MCAT, who graciously tapes this for us. Tonight's speaker, Dave Payne, is going to talk about sustainable venturing, as I said earlier. He is currently an adjunct professor at the University of Colorado, Leeds School of Business, and also a principal, I guess would be the right word, with Point 380 Consulting, and he's actually going to fill you in on all the other details that I don't know. So I'm going to ask Dave to come up now and take the mic from me, and away we'll go.
The lighting is a little challenging.
We'll let it down.
Okay, great. All right. Well, thanks for having me. It's really nice to be back in Missoula. I haven't been back here since my college days, when I had a couple friends attending here, and my perspective is a little different now. But my perspective is sustainable venturing. So tonight we're going to talk about what that means, a little bit about trying to reframe some issues that we all understand. Sustainability, I'm not going to spend too much time talking about what sustainability means. If you're a member of the Sustainable Business Council, you probably know that already. So we're going to move beyond, and hopefully try to move beyond some of the win-win methodology and the kind of conversation about sustainability that I've been involved with for years, having worked for an energy efficiency think tank for a number of years called Rocky Mountain Institute, talking about natural capitalism and how we're all going to save the world. It's not easy, and for all of you who are in the audience who are practicing sustainable business, you know it's really hard. So one of the perspectives, this sustainable venturing perspective, hopefully will help you unpack the path, identify the road that you can get on towards sustainability, a couple of the methods and tactics you can use to get there. But before we get started with that, I'll talk about the white elephant in the room. There's a lot going on this week. There's a lot going on tonight. And for those of you who are not paleontologists, clearly most of you are not. Either that or you know how to operate the TiVo. We're here to talk about sustainable venturing, but meanwhile, in the background, the world is crumbling, the sky is falling. There's a lot going on. Sorry about that. The regulators are waking up after a 7 or 8 year hiatus. Fortunately, Wall Street executives are going to be able to find their golden parachutes. And we have a bailout plan that's definitely going to work. And of course, my favorite of the series is this one, How to Panic a Baby Boomer. Yes, there are reports of bad assets. I figured that would resonate with a few folks in the room. So this is all going on, and I promised Sue that I'd try to link a little bit of current events into this talk. So forgive me if it's a little awkward, the links, but I think you'll see that regulation and the regulatory failures that have gone on on Wall Street actually do have a lot of relevance to the sustainable venturing concept. So we're going to link back to this in a little while. But first off, a puzzle. I'm going to ask you to identify a market sector. So this market sector has investments totaling about $15 billion since 2000. It's growing by an average annual rate of 68%. 100% average annual growth since 2004. It's the 6th largest VC investment category and has 7% venture capital market share. Any guesses at this point what we're talking about? Yes. Clean tech. What is clean tech? You know, we're going to talk a little bit about that, but there is a boom going on up until really recently because the bottom has fallen out of the venture capital markets in the last few days, and a lot of the funding has dried up. But what is behind this trend is a desire to operate more sustainably, to bring about a more sustainable world, you know, to fund the next industrial revolution. And it's a mode of thinking that's shifted. Envirotech, so to speak, is a more regulatory-driven idea, the more sort of conservation mentality. This is Jimmy Carter putting on a sweater in the White House. This might be those old, you know, solar thermal panels up on your house that have been leaking, and slow growth, kind of leading with your green chin, save the world first, maybe make a profit. The clean tech revolution has really been driven by economic market drivers and consumer market drivers. It's growing rapidly, as you saw, more entrepreneurial mentality, high use of IT, and so on. There's a lot of buzz about clean tech. Great. Are you and I going to go get venture capital funding for a clean tech initiative? Possibly, but most likely not. You know, it sounds like a great idea, but how do we get there? You know, it's a long way from being in Missoula, being in Boulder, Colorado, where I'm from, starting a business, and then getting, you know, your 3rd round of funding from a big VC in Silicon Valley. So how do we get there? Tonight we're going to talk about that. We're going to start with framing. As you know, we're going to talk a little bit about the environmental problems as business opportunities. This is nothing new necessarily for you, but I'm going to give some examples that might broaden the range of opportunities and scope of opportunities that you consider. We're going to talk about sustainable business trends and drivers, things that are driving change in the marketplace. We're going to talk about sustainable venturing, this term that was coined by a former professor of mine and now a colleague. We have a couple papers on the subject, one that's under revision right now called Escape from the Green Prison. And it's an entrepreneurial perspective on sustainability. And it's a theoretical framework, but with some real practical considerations and practical background. And our last sort of goal for tonight's talk is we're going to help move towards a roadmap for sustainable venturing. So what does that look like? And tomorrow's workshop is all about building that roadmap. So quickly, framing, this is just the assumptions. Business is an agent of positive social and environmental change. Entrepreneurs, and this is a pretty critical, this assumption doesn't always fly in the academic world, but entrepreneurs correct market failures in the marketplace. They actually can make structural changes to our markets to improve sustainability, and that's a critical element of the sustainable venturing mindset. The systems thinking mindset is just taking a broader perspective outside of my own bottom line, maybe outside of my industry, reaching across industry boundaries, maybe even reaching across international boundaries like our local entrepreneurs are doing here, reaching directly to China and finding sources for their products, but thinking broadly and taking a whole systems perspective. And then lastly, the lens of strategic management and entrepreneurship. Academic framing, we're not going to spend too much time on that. Quickly, who am I? Sue introduced me. I spent a number of years at Rocky Mountain Institute. Amory Lovins, who is my boss, we traveled around, sold the idea of natural capitalism, energy efficiency, factor 4, breakthroughs in industrial efficiency. I still do a fair bit of consulting work in that realm, working with companies to make them more efficient. And a lot of that theory and practice has been supported and has driven my research and education and teaching at various institutions. In my history, I've spent some time in consulting with a firm in Denver called Domani. Did some work on climate change projects with a number of big multinationals. Did a climate change strategy for the world's largest producer of alcoholic beverages, Diageo, which is fascinating. And I now currently work with Point380 part-time. Way back when, started a .com called Conduit Group, and most recently am working on a kind of new hybrid entrepreneurial venture called the 520 Collective. And what we're trying to do is create a boundary organization between education, universities, and businesses to provide executive education and training. Universities don't do a good job of doing executive education because their academic researchers are trying to get published in journal articles, academic journal articles. Businesses don't necessarily have the time to go take night classes or go to university, and we're trying to create a boundary organization that's going to hold that space and do a lot of executive education and training. And we're getting a lot of interest from the city of Denver, Boulder. City of Boulder Chamber of Commerce has hired us to do a couple projects and trainings. So that's a bit of my personal background. And what's, for me, bringing me to this sort of sustainable venturing discussion goes back to probably 1989 when I had a long beard and was taking a year off and had a grant from the Mellon Foundation to study winter desiccation in red spruce up in New Hampshire. And, reading Earth First Journal and becoming an environmentalist. And the Exxon Valdez spill happened. And I felt compelled to go up and take the train from Whittier and Scrub Rocks up in Alaska, working for VCO, and it was a pretty compelling and pretty gut-wrenching education in the negative impacts that business can have on the environment. Kind of disempowering, though. I came back to college, and I said, "Geez, where are we gonna go from here? We can't stop burning oil. We can't necessarily change our whole fuel infrastructure and energy infrastructure. Where do we go from here?" A number of years later, in 2001, I was at Rocky Mountain Institute, and I went back up to Alaska. And I did a Brooks Range and a Latna paddling trip with my sister, who's a National Outdoor Leadership School instructor. And I was working at RMI and talking about energy efficiency and how we were going to save the world with megawatts, and ran into the pipeline, this big pipeline, and I realized that everyone in Alaska was getting paid on this stuff, and the energy efficiency story just wasn't resonating. And a megawatt still isn't a megawatt, so what do you do? How do you create the structural changes? And I came back to the Institute a couple months later, and some guy had taken a rifle, shot the pipeline from 75 feet, and 120 gallons per minute spilled out of the pipeline for 36 hours. That spill alone amounted to more than all the reported oil spills in 2000, and it dumped a reported 285,000 gallons out of the pipeline for that 36 hours. We have a brittle and potentially really damaging energy infrastructure. How are we going to change that? Can we change it with megawatts? Maybe not. I left the Institute in 2002, and I came down to Boulder because there was a guy down there who was teaching natural capitalism at the business school. And his name's Tom Dean, and that's how I met Sue, because Sue took a class with Tom up in Washington?
University of Oregon.
At University of Oregon, that's right.
12 years ago.
Yeah. Well, I met Tom. We actually went tele-skiing in Highland Bowl. It's one of my favorite things in the world to do. And his tele-skiing ability is just as good as his academic research ability, and I thought that was a match made in heaven. So I came down to Boulder and started a PhD program. My last name's Payne, so I thought that'd be pretty cool to be Dr. Payne. And along the way, I was at the business school and I was spouting eco-efficiency and environmental subjects. And I was at the business school that had just gotten $36 million in grant funding to promote sustainability. And I thought, this is a dream come true. And I lasted about a semester and I realized that the money wasn't going to change it. The institution was still flawed. The incentives were still flawed. And so I very quickly realized I needed to get my own source of funding. So I went after a National Science Foundation grant and studied climate change for about 3 years with colleagues across schools. It was an IGERT NSF grant. And I studied climate and started to make sense of some of the things I was seeing in Alaska a couple years before, and then in a subsequent trip. Who's been up to Glacier National Park recently? Think they're going to rename it anytime soon? The climate is changing. There's still debate over whether, and how much human impacts there are, but there's obviously a substantial impact that humans are having. Jumping around a little bit in my history, just trying to lay some background here, but I also spent some time on a boat that I renovated called Tempest Fugit, and I sailed for about 2,500 miles up around Canada, around Cap Bay, up to Newfoundland and Prince Edward Island and Nova Scotia. And I met a lot of lobstermen and fishermen because I would often tie off their boats when I went places. And I've got a couple photos here, courtesy of Colin Woodard, who's a fellow I met on that journey. He wrote a book called Ocean's End. And this is just a before and after shot of the effects of bottom trawling. You drop a big heavy net and you scrape the ocean floor to get your fish. Not very sustainable. And the trends in fish stocks are pretty substantial and pretty substantially negative. CO2 emissions are rising. Anyone depressed yet? We're responsible for a lot of it. This is some CO2 data from Niwot Ridge, which is a CU research station. We found at 0.380 at 0.380 parts per million. We're now at 385. Things are going up. Things are changing. Business has a lot to do with it. And temperatures are rising, and there's all sorts of impacts, potential, and impacts that are happening this very moment. Health, agriculture, water, increased weather intensity, droughts, floods. Boy, you can't see that picture all that well, but this is that classic photograph of the Earth at night, and you can kind of see where all the lights are on. The upshot of all of this is there's a lot of change going on. We're impacting the Earth, and for the last 15 minutes I've been telling you my personal story and giving some background on why we need to do something. For the next 45 minutes, we're going to talk about how to do it. First thing we don't do is stick our heads in the sand or walk around and say everything's going to be okay. It's not. Change is happening. We can either make the change or the change can happen to us. Threat or opportunity. You know, if you're a shark, climate change, global warming might be an opportunity. Indeed, the overtly liberal rag, The Economist, says, for far-sighted companies, the environment may turn out to be the biggest opportunity for enterprise and innovation the industrial world has ever seen. And that I would agree with. Furthermore, the existence of these problems implies the presence of economic opportunity. So the very existence of environmental problems suggests that there's opportunity for business. Because how do we solve problems in a market-based economy? We solve it sometimes with the government, but more often than not, we solve it with business innovation. There is a demand and a growing demand for sustainable solutions out there. Now, you might not be seeing it in a price signal or in a demand for green products. We're going to talk about why that may be so and how we can change that. But there's a lot of demand out there, latent and present, and sustainable venturing is a way to get there. So you've probably seen this slide, so I'm going to go through it really quickly. You know, just a simple equation. What we're going to talk about is here. I've spent a lot of time here working on consumption and efficiency. What we're going to talk about today is technology, and we're going to talk about technology in the broader sense, you know, the technology of the actual things, lightweighting materials and efficient production, transportation and so on, but also the technology of our institutions and rulemaking bodies and so on and so forth. But the drivers of this change in the marketplace are not that sort of old envirotech mindset. We're talking about drivers, at least in the sustainable venturing mindset, of real world and real present problems, the issues of urbanization, transportation, health concerns. Responses to those in the marketplace are innovations in green building and new urbanism. Hybrid technology, you know, maybe down the road, fuel cell automobiles, certainly renewably fueled automobiles. I took the green taxi today back from the airport, and you know, I'm on my second hybrid. Saves me money. I hate going to the gas pump. This is good green technology. It sells. There's demand out there, and we're seeing at least linear, but a lot of exponential growth in some of these market areas. Well, we're not all going to play in those markets, but we're going to talk about those and how they evolve to the robust markets that they are now, and how we can create new markets for new types of products and services. We're going to focus on some of these, though, that there's current demand for and current supply for as well. Ultimately, these are providing solutions for what sort of the big three when we talk in the sustainability consulting world: energy, water, waste. We're solving these problems now, and businesses and entrepreneurs are solving these problems now. A few of them. I make sure that when I'm teaching at the business school that I get a lot of guest speakers, and Boulder and Denver have a lot of green businesses that were founded there or exist there, and these are just a few of them. These are all ones who've come to speak to my class over the last couple of years, and there's a ton of sustainable ventures. UQM, you might not have heard of them. They're making sort of highly efficient motors. Varex is a fuel cell startup company, and GreenSpark is a pretty cool venture capital firm. Lots of sustainable ventures. We're going to talk in more detail about a few of them. But I did a quick surf of the SBC website, and this is a random selection of members of your organization. Sue told me about Green Taxi. I've taken it twice today. And they're getting 48.3 miles per gallon with the air conditioning on in stop-and-go traffic in Missoula. It's not bad. And that's one of those classic win-win situations where it is a little higher first cost, but on the margin, these guys are making more money than their competitor. And it's just classic win-win green business. This is what I would call sustainable discovery opportunities. You know, just finding these things in the marketplace, you know, better, more efficient ways of doing business that make you more money. It's almost a no-brainer. But lots of stuff going on in construction. We'll plug for Balance Tech. You know some of these businesses, and you visit these businesses with some regularity, I hope. Each of them has a couple, interesting things that they promote and they're talking about. Some that you might not know about or you might not immediately think of for sustainability. Big Sky Brewing promotes their Aluma bottle. So instead of heavy glass that's really expensive and carbon intensive to move around to a recycling center, they've they're I think the first microbrewery to implement this aluminum bottle technology that's very lightweight, very well engineered, uses a lot less materials, highly recyclable, and that's green. That's good. So some pretty innovative stuff. So a few markets looking at this realm. We're looking at foods, we're looking at construction, we're looking at transportation. And I'm going to dive into a couple of these developments. I'm going to use a few examples. I'm going to start to tease out a few things that made these markets viable and robust, and how we might develop those markets going forward. Organic foods. Well, we all know the numbers have gone up since this slide was made, but consistent exponential growth, and a big milestone in the development of the organic foods movement was the establishment of a standard, a federal standard. It took a lot of years. Guys like Mark Retzloff, who's Boulder-based with Horizon Organic, were pushing for standards. There were, folks in Oregon with their tilth, organic farmers getting together and developing norms of conduct and practices that they could share, and knowledge, in the same way that SBC brings different businesses together. But these markets have become formalized over time, and the sort of final stamp of formalization is this federal standard. We're going to talk a little bit more about how that happened and why that's important. It's growing, and this is one of those big miracle markets in the green space. Organic foods. We all know Horizon. I think it's interesting, their mission statement, the way they promote their mission and the way they talk about it is food safety, the environment, animal welfare, and so on, but it's really about nutrition and health. And one of the things that I credit Horizon for doing in this marketplace is they established a different type of knowledge about organics. It wasn't just a greener way of producing product. It was actually a healthier product. And they started to inform the marketplace about the health problems associated with conventional produce and the health benefits of buying and drinking organic milk. And in the academic sense, they corrected that market failure. There was an imperfect information in the marketplace. People really didn't know enough about organics. And folks like Mark Retzloff and Horizon and Enlightened Self-Interest embarked on information campaigns to correct that market failure, to put good information out in the marketplace and drive demand. And that was a change. That was one of the elements, critical elements of the success of the organics movement, was eliminating that market failure of imperfect information. White Wave is another one that you're familiar with. And I look at Liquid Planet. When I look at their website, I've not been there for coffee yet, although tomorrow morning I expect I will. But these are companies that are buying organic, delivering an organic product. Bella Madre is doing all sort of made in the US, organic materials. Pretty exciting stuff. And you can tell me more about these local businesses, but those are just a couple examples. I'm going to go through a few of these marketplaces, and we're going to start to unpack what drove them. Green building, we know the stats, 40% of the energy, 33 some say, but it's somewhere between 33 and 40%. Lots of construction debris, and our buildings consume a lot of the energy and materials on this planet today. And there's a lot of demand for a change in that institution. There are local companies. I always have someone from McStain neighborhoods, and Alpenglass, when I worked at Rocky Mountain Institute, they provided the argon-filled windows that we had at the Institute. And at the big main building, we didn't have HVAC because we had such a tight insulated box. And the Alpen windows were a critical part of that. Here in Missoula, Construction site services, these guys are doing on-site recycling and repurposing of materials, so crushing stone and so on for reuse on site, and recycling, consulting around energy, and architectural design around sustainability. Stuff is happening everywhere. What's driving it? Energy Star, federal, LEED, U.S. Green Building Council. So what was happening in the marketplace? Similar to the organic story, there wasn't enough information in the marketplace. The idea that the testimony of green contractors or folks trying to sell a green product, they say it's green, but how do we know it's green? And how do we know how green it is? And what does green really mean? We need to get together as a bunch of competitors, and the U.S. Green Building Council is formed, and we start to establish standards so we can tell the marketplace what green is. Then we can come up with a benchmark so that people, when they buy green, they know they're buying LEED Gold, LEED Platinum. So the Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design was developed and really has driven a lot of the market innovation and has provided a benchmark for that, for consumers, especially the LEED for Homes initiative, now coming out of the commercial sector and going into the home sector. I work on the Solar Home Tour every year in Boulder, and it's happening next week. We have the nation's first LEED Platinum home on the tour. Pretty exciting stuff, but I think we'll see a lot more activity in the marketplace around LEED. So we have an information campaign, we have some structural change, and we have, I think, well, actually I'm going to hold that thought. I'm just going to move on to the next slide. Boulder Green Building Guild is something that has done similar to what you're doing with Sustainable Business Council, again, bringing people together to form institutions, to form norms. And what's happening with BGBG is that they're substantially informing another aspect of the market, and that is they are helping craft and drive regulations, changes in the building code. These BGBG members have gotten pretty good at green building over the last few years. And they recognize they have a competitive advantage that's really under-realized. So when they're in a marketplace, there's some information, especially in a town like Missoula or Boulder. There are some consumers who want to buy green. But still their first cost concerns often trump their green concerns, and they often go with less sustainable houses and products and so on. These members of BGBG, contractors, architects, and so on, recognize that their green building skills are their profit potential is really under-realized in the marketplace unless a shift in code happens. So they're starting to push for regulatory changes in a form we call predation through regulation. They're actually trying to change the regulatory code to drive demand for green building and therefore achieve competitive advantage over their competitors who don't have the skills that they have. So really prime and drive the marketplace. So not just correcting that information failure, but also correcting or driving a regulatory change. So last market we're going to talk about is renewable energy. This is one of those classic cases of, a young entrepreneur. This was a CU graduate, Quail Hodak, started going door to door selling renewable energy credits. And he's one of the first and one of the sort of pioneers in this REC market. But they buy certificates from wind farms, sell them to individuals, used to literally door to door, now mostly over the internet, and have sold RECs to Wells Fargo, Whole Foods, Best Buy. They created an entirely new market, renewable energy credits. They were one of the early pioneers. And what they realized very quickly is that there were a few people, when they went door to door, they could sell this abstract concept. Like, okay, so I've got this power line coming into my house, and the electrons that are going into my electrical appliances are coming from the coal plant out in Craig. So you're selling me this certificate that buys me wind power that's being produced in Wyoming. How's that work? And a few consumers got it and bought it, whether out of guilt or just desire to prime the market for wind power. But there was some limits to that. And so the rec marketers, a number of them, Native Energy is another one, have gone about trying to standardize and formalize this market, trying to get some third-party verification and certification to make sure that these renewable energy credits are actually selling what they promise to be selling. Because if they don't sell what they promise to sell, the market, the bottom will fall out. You know, if you're selling mortgage-backed securities as a AAA rated investment, but underneath it all is a bunch of crap, what happens? You know, same thing with RECs, same thing with organic. What happens is people lose faith. They stop buying it, they short it, they dump it. So with almost all of these markets, one of the critical steps in the sort of sustainable venturing process is establishing credible standards and practices that the marketplace can trust. Part of that picture can be regulation. But there's more to it. I'll get to that. Last example, because, I don't know, fisheries are a passion of mine, is you can look at, you know, catches are going down, harvests are going up. Obviously, there's a lot of aquaculture. There's a fascinating example on the island of Monhegan where I tied my boat up. There's a big mooring ball where the Balmy Days, which is this boat that services Monhegan, it's way off the coast of Maine, tied up on that. And then at night, I couldn't stay there, so I had to find a place to tie off. And I tied off against a lobster fishing boat and got to know a few people who are, a few lobstermen who work off of Monhegan. And over some time, through those conversations with them and some research that I did on my own, I found a fascinating example of sustainable venturing. We haven't defined sustainable venturing yet, but we're getting there. What they did was they established property rights to the fishery. What was happening was the fishermen from Friendship, Maine, of all places, were coming out and actually overfishing the lobster fishery off of Monhegan. And the Monhegan lobstermen had voluntary rules of conduct that they'd established amongst themselves. They wouldn't catch the shedders, they call this, or soft-shell lobsters. They'd wait until they'd matured. They'd notch the tails of the females and throw them back in. They had certain norms of conduct and rules of the game that they'd established amongst themselves to maintain the sustainability of the lobster fishery. But what was happening is that these rival lobstermen were coming from the coast, and they were coming out and raiding their sustainable lobster fishery. So they actually went and established property rights. They went to the state. First thing they did actually was they went out with shotguns and they scared off the guys from Friendship, and they had sort of informal property rights. Basically, you had to be a member of the Monhegan Harbor Gang, or else you weren't gonna, you know, escape with your life if you went to the Monhegan lobster fishery. So becoming a member of the Harbor Gang was this sort of informal property right. It gave you a right to fish there or to catch lobsters there. But over time, in the same way that QAI and Oregon Tilth sort of evolved over time to USDA organic, or green building standards amongst a bunch of builders, you know, kind of rolled up to LEED standards and maybe, you know, other. The same thing happened here. The sort of evolution over time of another institutional change, the establishment of formal property rights. And they actually went to the state of Maine and got it. Here it is. We want to defend our sustainability. And now, the best lobsters are on Monhegan. It's a pain in the neck to get out there, but if you're willing to go out there, it's maybe the best lobster in Maine. And they charge a premium for it. So, what's going on here? Well, what we're seeing, or what we're starting to see, is a picture of entrepreneurial business initiatives that go beyond the sort of simple discovery of, well, you know, the kind of win-win situations like efficiency or pollution prevention, or meeting a sort of already existing demand for green products. And going beyond that, changing the way we do business, changing the institutions, changing the norms of operation. It's a step beyond. How does it happen? What does that look like? The academic term we use and the papers we write is institutional entrepreneurship. And what that entails is, in sort of real terms, the establishment of some of these institutions. So institutions are the norms, the rules of the game, essentially. So when we use the term institutions, we're talking about the rules of the game. So we're changing the rules of the game. Entrepreneurs changing the rules of the game of the marketplaces in which they do business. I've already talked about the organic examples. What we've talked about in building codes, energy markets, renewable portfolio standard. I mean, you guys have solar plexus here in town and a number of other vendors of renewable energy. We have a great little company called, actually not so little anymore, 45 employees, called Namaste Solar Electric. It's a cooperatively run business. Guys spent a lot of time in Nepal, installing off-grid solar systems. When he started his business, joined the Solar Energy Industry Alliance and started lobbying hard for an RPS, a renewable portfolio standard, in Colorado. He changed the rules of the game and drove demand for his product, along with a bunch of competitors. But what they did was they created demand right out of the gate. And I bought a system on a renovation that I did, and it would have cost $14,000 to put this array on the roof. It cost $7,000, because Colorado's RPS mandates that Xcel Energy produce X percentage. It's 10% right now. It's going up to 15%. And then a percentage of that, about 4%, needs to be solar. And when Xcel looked at that problem, the way they solved it was providing a rebate to their customers to put grid-tied solar systems onto the grid. And that subsidy happened. It was an entrepreneurial gesture, largely. There was a lot of public demand for it as well. But Namaste Solar Electric was one of the ones who really drove that. And then this element of property rights. Codes of conduct, like the Maine fishermen, as an example. The term that's sometimes bannered around is co-opetition. There's a book by that name. It's a little cutesy, but IBM's about as far from cutesy as you can get as businesses go. This is an element of this institutional transformation that we call sustainable venturing. And at long last, I am going to define this. So what might this look like in Missoula? It might look like a Missoula Green Building Guild, if you don't already have it. Or maybe a Natural Foods Alliance. Are there limits on the existing win-win opportunities in natural foods and building? I mean, all these competitors are going out and trying to sell to a kind of small segment, the green consumer, and so on. Are there changes you can make within your community to actually drive more business and to see the kind of sustainability you want to achieve in Missoula and also do good business along the way? And in Boulder, we passed a carbon tax. It was the nation's first municipal carbon tax. But what it has done is actually put a price signal on energy and driven even more demand for energy efficiency and renewable energy. All right, we're going to get to 3 general types. Sort of little revision or review here. Industry norms, voluntary standards. These are the performance standards, monitoring, certifying, and sanctioning. This is the organic standards, information campaigns. This is sort of the 3 underpinnings of this sustainable venturing. Property rights, tradable emissions permits, and so on. Government legislation and regulation. So what is sustainable venturing? We've been talking about. How do you define it? We argue sort of theoretically that a lot of problems arise from a failure to conceptualize entrepreneurship properly. Entrepreneurs change markets. Sustainable venturing is creation and pursuit of new opportunities through the modification of political, regulatory, institutional systems, eliminating barriers, enhancing sustainability. This goes back to 1999. By pursuing sustainable venturing and changing institutions, firms can reduce social costs of their activities and put the hurt on their competitors. So it's subtle, but we're going to try to put a darker underline on it. There's a difference here between this sort of entrepreneurial discovery, exploited opportunities available under existing incentive and reward systems, and exploit opportunities that require the alteration of incentive and reward systems. So this is this creation idea. Why would you do this? Why would you go after? Why would you become a sustainable venturer? They're intractable. They're hard. Institutions are hard to change. You have to be more than just alert to a little price signal out there, a little demand. A customer comes to your coffee shop and says, do you have organic coffee? It's more than that. It's actually looking up your supply chain and making sure that the actual production of your coffee is sustainable, or going after some of the things that your customers may not be asking for yet, like fair trade. You know, who's actually producing this stuff? It takes more effort. Sustainable ventures are mountains that need to be built before they're climbed. They're hard to do. But those who pursue them can find a source of long-term competitive advantage. Because it's hard to establish these institutions. Classic example, Chicago Climate Exchange. Why is 20% of the US industrial emissions being traded voluntarily, capped and traded in Chicago Climate Exchange? I mean, why are companies doing that? 20%. IBM, Ford, Motorola, DTE, Waste Management. Why are they doing that? They're building this institution. There are a lot of costs around that. The reason why, a number of reasons why, but one of them is they get a seat at the table at the very beginning of developing this new regulatory regime. They see a change down the road, and they're going to be part of building the institution from the get-go, voluntarily. So they're at the table drafting the regulations right away, early on. And as these regulations evolve over time, they were there at the beginning, and when federal regulations are adopted, you know it's going to look an awful lot like Chicago Climate Exchange, because businesses have big lobbying firms that work for them. So they get to the table early. They develop competencies early on, looking at monitoring their carbon, measuring it, accounting for it, trading it. And so when things change over time and when markets get established that they're going to push for, they've got competitive advantage over the ones who aren't at the table, who aren't participating in CCX. In fact, at a certain point, they establish competencies like the organic farmers or the green builders who are saying, we're good at this now. Regulation's actually okay. A regulatory shift will actually further my competitive advantage. If green building has to happen, they're going to be coming to me. So if a carbon tax or a cap and trade program has to happen, which it does, some form of carbon controls is going to have to happen. Having been on the practice field in Chicago Climate Exchange, having pursued this sustainable venturing opportunity of, forming CCX, having done that, you're going to have competitive advantage, and you might actually push for federal regulation over time. Well, I'm going to skip through these because we're running short on time. It's an important concept, certainly theoretically, but also practically, in that we've tapped out a lot of the win-win solutions. We know how to do efficiency. We know how to do materials reduction and so on. I mean, it's the bread and butter of .380's business, a lot of consulting firms. There's a lot of activity going on in that area. But the real sustainable competitive advantage is actually going to require fundamental changes in the institutions, the rules, the norms, the rules of the game, the way we do business over time, and the sustainable venturing mindset is really important to making that happen. A few shifts from threat to opportunity, from discovery of win-win to creation of new opportunities, and then fundamentally from individual to network. It's not something, very often it's not something you can do alone. So what we're doing tomorrow is taking the concept of sustainable venturing, and we're actually going to work through individual initiatives and do a network map. We're actually going to do a causal loop diagram, a network map of individual initiatives and a desire for sustainable Missoula, and actually map these sustainable ventures. What changes in the rules of the game would actually drive more business to you as an individual entrepreneur? And how can you partner up and link up with other businesses that may be your competitors to make this happen? So it's not easy. Wisdom and warning, this is Howard Klee, long gone, from Amoco. And then this is much longer ago, and this is Hobbes. These both speak to the limits of the win-win sustainability initiatives. You know, at a certain point, unless it's going to benefit your bottom line within a reasonable amount of time and the paybacks are short enough and so on, you're just not necessarily going to stick your neck out to pursue these sort of more radical sustainability initiatives. But the solution to this dilemma that Hobbes talks about is the Hobbesian sovereign. Establishing the sovereign, as he describes it, is someone who has the right to maintain discipline in a group, to make sure that we actually all play by the same rules of the game and achieve the things we really want to do. I mean, businesses don't want to trash the environment. It's just the rules of the game oftentimes drive that kind of behavior. So you can get together and mutually agree upon rules that help you behave the way you want to. And if you can do it with a business mindset for profit, you know, organic standards create margin for farm produce. I mean, you can command a premium when you've got certified organic. U.S. Green Building Council LEED standards are starting to show real premiums in the marketplace. And I've got a ton of research to back that up. The premiums that the lobstermen in Monhegan command for their Monhegan lobsters are based on the institution that they created. A more sustainable lobstering community, but better product. But they had to get together, they're all competitors, and change the rules of the game to make it happen. It's not easy. It's not easy. A lot of examples, and there's a lot of research to back it up. And there's also a lot of evidence that the absence of it can create disasters. What's going on right now in the regulatory world is an expression of that and evidence of that. I'm not saying that regulation is going to solve everything, quite to the contrary, but expanding our concept of regulation and our concept of institutions to these norms of conduct that sometimes eventually evolve into formal rules and so on is important. That's the end of the overview of sustainable venturing. I know Sue wanted to talk about tomorrow's workshop. I'm happy to discuss that, but we're out of time. It's 7 o'clock, so why don't I stop there and ask you for questions. Can we go for another couple minutes? So any questions, comments? Love to hear from you. Yeah.
The slide that had sort of the 3 fundamental facets of sustainable venturing seems to me as though the real challenge and or difficulty in doing this is you're trying to educate and retool institutions that are either overarching your sector of an economy or trying to provide some sort of semblance of standards and certitude in the products provided. That requires competitors basically coming together to agree how to create a platform that all of them gain by relative to their other competitors.
Yeah.
And that has proven in a number of places for me to be pretty difficult to
Yeah,
do.
incredibly difficult.
So it's like, it's a super complicated social and institutional challenge.
Yeah. I mean,
Is that why you say they're intractable and that individually it's difficult?
Indeed. And where we see evidence of these institutions actually, where it can actually form and evolve over time into the more powerful institutions that become, regional, state, federal, global standards, is when you have proximity. Cooperation, I mean, certainly scientifically, the game theorists and the social theorists who look at the evolution of cooperation, oftentimes it's the promise of a future game, essentially. You and I are going to sit together, we might be competitors, but we're going to agree that we have this theoretical change we want to do. We want to, what industry are you in?
Actually, I work in climate change.
Okay. Let's see. All right, trying to bring climate down to earth, huh? Locally, all right, I'm not going to take that challenge on right now, although I've spent a lot of time in that. All right, no, I'll do it. All right. Let's go to Chicago, the Chicago Board of Trade. So you look at the evolution of Chicago Climate Exchange from Richard Sandor's environmental financial products and the grant-funded institution that he started there. The early adopters and the early competitors at the table were long, old, a lot of them were long, old, established companies. And they knew that they had lobbyists, PR firms, and so on. They were going to be around for a while.
Yep.
So
this was the cost of doing future business.
Yeah, and
they needed to learn.
They needed to learn. They also had they had the ability to punish each other in a sense publicly. There was an incentive in this group at CCX. There was I guess an incentive just to cooperate because if you didn't, you get kicked out of the group, kicked out of the club. So a lot of times, these organizations evolve just through sort of the turgor pressure of membership, and just belonging. It's sort of human nature to try to stay together. The institution of marriage, it's sort of self-reinforcing. Not sure if I'm addressing that all that well, but
I'm not sure how my wife would like that explanation.
Yeah.
Pressure of
Yeah. But what we've seen, to sort of go back to the point and what the research points to, is, the proximity part of this equation is pretty critical, and that is, we have informal ways of reinforcing these institutions. I'm going to scowl at you at the coffee shop, and the threat of that scowl might be enough for me to cooperate, behave in this voluntary institution. This, if SBC said we're going to do a 10% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions amongst all our businesses, and there's no enforcement, there's no real penalty, but we all see each other every week, and if we're all reporting, so if there's good knowledge in the group, we're all reporting our emissions, then you with the 20% increase over the last 3 years, you're kind of an outcast, and you are getting scowled at the coffee shop. And sometimes that's enough to get these things started until the incentive to formalize it starts to kick in. And that can come from the establishment of property rights and so on, the more formal institutions that create the incentives to really lock it in. But sometimes the informal punishments are the ones, kicking you out of the club, scowling at you at the coffee shop are enough to get this stuff started. And that's when you look at the origins of Oregon Health and green building standards, the Lobsterman and so on, lots of other examples. A lot of times that's what gets it started. Lobsterman, it was shotgun, but yeah. Any other questions, comments?
So from a mile high perspective, for you personally, being that you've done this a long time and have been in the first couple slides where you were showing the cartoons with the devastation on Wall Street and maybe devastation of the whole economy, what's your prognosis now? Where's it going to go for a time?
On Wall Street?
Or just funding of, creating these groups that are promoting better
Yeah.
business models? Are they in a quagmire for a time?
We had the institutions, and so it wasn't an institutional failure. It was a failure of the certification, verification, monitoring. There are certain elements that maintain the institution that we might have skipped over a little bit too much in this presentation, but it was a failure of enforcement, not a failure of institutions. We had credit rating agencies, but they just happened to be in bed with the ones who were selling the product that they were rating. And that was a failure. And it was a failure that failed those who created the institution in the first place. Why did those institutions evolve in the first place? The credit rating agencies evolved because the people selling the products needed someone, a third party, to support the value of these abstract things they were selling, these derivatives and mortgage-backed securities. They're pretty abstract. It's like a carbon credit or a renewable energy credit. How are you going to tell me when I buy a TerraPass to offset my car's carbon emissions? I'm probably not going to buy it unless I trust the institution or I trust the institution that's certifying the institution. And when there's not enough monitoring and regulation to support the value of these abstract things, the bottom falls out. So it was in the best interest of Wall Street to make sure robust regulation happened. And it's pretty interesting. I'm starting to see some conversation around this, where Washington was hearing something from Wall Street that might not have been, Wall Street wasn't necessarily asking for deregulation. Maybe individuals on Wall Street, but the Wall Street, as a group, regulation was supporting the whole thing, and the enforcement was supporting the whole value. And the failure of regulation is what made it collapse. And everyone knew that, but there's always these individual incentives that pull against group incentives. Garrett Hardin talks about the tragedy of the commons, and at a certain point, once everyone else was breaking ranks and cheating, then it was a race to the bottom. And that happens, if the tragedy of the commons, a classic, maybe I'll leave you with this sort of last example. The tragedy of the commons, who's familiar with this concept? Pretty common story, but you've got common land, let's say it's here in Missoula, and you've got, a few hundred acres of grazing land, and you've got 10 cattlemen who are grazing cattle on it, and they have to share it. Without a rule regime to enforce sustainable grazing of that land, everyone has an incentive to put as many cattle on it and get as much grass before it's all gone as they can. And so, the lobsterman was the same example. So we establish these rules of conduct, and it's in our best interest to have the Hobbesian sovereign, someone telling us, someone enforcing this cooperative norm. It's in all our best interest, but we need to, when we establish these institutions, we need to have the punishment right, and we need to not lose sight of the fact that threat of punishment is a pretty important element of the maintenance of the turgor pressure of institutions. It's kind of abstract, heady stuff, but hopefully I was able to ground it a little bit in some of these examples. And I think tomorrow we're going to try to tease out some other examples that are, really directly relevant to the Missoula economy. We've got these examples of organics and lobstermen and green building standards, but maybe there's something here that we can do, some institutions that can drive the same kind of change. But you raise a critical point, and that is enforcement is essential. The institutions were there, the enforcement wasn't, and the value's gone. Yeah. Well, thank you. Thanks for